The phones in Washington went quiet as tankers kept moving. The shift didn't announce itself with urgency. It arrived already completed. While officials were still parsing language and jurisdiction, oil was moving under contracts written for a system the United States doesn't command. Payments cleared through channels immune to interruption, insurance was handled elsewhere, and enforcement tools that once froze decisions in place arrived after the process had finished executing. What made the moment dangerous wasn't speed or confrontation. It was the realization that leverage had expired quietly, replaced by procedures that no longer required American approval. By the time U.S. officials finished reading the Venezuelan announcement, the oil was already flowing under a different set of rules. Caracas had just confirmed what energy traders in Asia had been whispering about for weeks. A permanent, Yuan-denominated oil hub built with China and Russia, operating outside the dollar system and beyond U.S. financial reach. The implications were immediate and structural. This was not a shipment, it was a switch. Earlier this year, the United States escalated financial pressure on Venezuela by expanding terrorism-related designations that effectively sealed the country off from dollar clearing, correspondent banking, and Western insurance markets. Reuters reported at the time that even humanitarian payment channels were being delayed or rejected, not by policy, but by fear inside global banks. The intent was explicit, total financial isolation to force political compliance. What followed was less anticipated. When a system is sealed completely, it does not collapse inward. It creates a vacuum, and vacuums attract architects. At the same time, Caracas executed the most consequential decision of the entire crisis. All new oil contracts would be priced, settled, and cleared in Chinese yuan. Not partially, not experimentally, fully. China's customs data later showed a sharp increase in yuan-settled Venezuelan energy trades routed through Chinese intermediaries. The dollar was not replaced symbolically, it was removed operationally. This mattered for one reason above all else: payment plumbing. Currency denomination is cosmetic without infrastructure. China did not simply offer yuan liquidity. It plugged Venezuela directly into its cross-border interbank payment system, known as CIPS. Unlike SWIFT, which remains heavily influenced by United States and European regulators, CIPS operates under Chinese jurisdiction. According to the People's Bank of China, transaction volumes on CIPS rose sharply over the past year, driven by sanctioned and non-aligned economies seeking redundancy. Venezuela became one of the most complete integrations yet. This was not financial diversification. It was system migration. One consequence followed immediately. United States sanctions lost their primary enforcement lever. Funds could now move from Chinese buyers to Venezuelan accounts without touching United States correspondent banks, without dollar clearing, and without Western compliance oversight. As an analyst at J.P. Morgan told the Wall Street Journal, sanctions are only effective when payment routes are monopolized. Parallel rails change the calculus. But oil was only the surface layer. Russia's interest extended far beyond barrels. Alongside energy agreements, Moscow signed dozens of contracts covering gas development, logistics infrastructure, and mining rights. Reuters confirmed that Russian firms received access to large sections of the Orinoco mining arc, a region containing gold, diamonds, coltan, and other strategic minerals. These are not decorative resources. Coltan and rare earths are core inputs for advanced electronics, defense systems, and energy storage technologies. For Russia, locked out of many Western supply chains, this represented geographic diversification of strategic materials. For Venezuela, it meant monetizing assets that had been politically frozen and technically underdeveloped. According to data from Venezuela's mining ministry cited by Bloomberg, foreign investment commitments tied to these agreements exceed several $billions over the next decade. The numbers are opaque by design. The direction is not. There was a second, quieter layer to the strategy resilience at the retail level. Sanctions had not only frozen sovereign accounts, they had paralyzed everyday transactions. Visa and MasterCard networks were unreliable or unavailable. Cash shortages followed. Russia introduced its MIR payment system into Venezuela as an alternative card network, according to Russia's central bank. This allowed domestic commerce to resume using rails immune to U.S. banking pressure. It was not elegant, it was functional. Parallel to this, Venezuelan state entities and private intermediaries increasingly turned to blockchain-based stablecoins. The New York Times reported earlier this year that USDT-denominated transactions surged in sanctioned economies as a workaround for frozen banking access. These transfers are pegged to the dollar's value, but move outside traditional financial institutions. It is not de-dollarization in theory, it is dollar replication without American control. Oil still had to move physically. That required another adaptation. A network of aging tankers with opaque ownership structures began carrying Venezuelan crude through indirect routes. Maritime data reviewed by Reuters showed ships regularly disabling transponders, changing flags, and transferring cargo ship to ship in international waters. Insurers avoided the paper trail. Buyers avoided publicity. The oil moved anyway. Sanctions enforcement had become probabilistic. There was, however, one constraint that no workaround could solve: force. Every alternative system remains vulnerable if it can be physically interrupted. That is where Russia's involvement took on its most stabilizing form. Moscow has supplied Venezuela with air defense systems, including the S-300, and continues military technical cooperation that includes training and maintenance. The Kremlin does not publicize deployment details. It does not need to. The signal is sufficient. According to defense analysts cited by the Financial Times, the presence of Russian air defense infrastructure dramatically raises the cost of any external military action. It does not guarantee protection. It introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is deterrence. This security layer changed the risk profile of every economic decision. Oil fields could be developed, ports could be upgraded, payment hubs could operate, not because conflict was impossible, but because escalation became expensive. China fought a different battle entirely. When the United States announced airspace and transport restrictions tied to its sanctions enforcement, Beijing responded within hours. China's foreign ministry condemned the measures using language rarely applied to Western powers, framing them as colonial behavior and reiterating that Latin America should remain a zone of peace. This was not improvised rhetoric. It was calibrated messaging. By invoking colonialism, China aligned itself with historical memory across the global South. By emphasizing sovereignty, it positioned itself as a partner rather than an enforcer. The New York Times noted that Chinese diplomatic language in recent years has increasingly focused on moral contrast rather than ideological alignment. Venezuela became the stage. The effect was cumulative. While the United States enforced compliance, China offered continuity. While Washington framed pressure as law enforcement, Beijing framed it as coercion. For many governments watching, the distinction mattered. At this point, the story stops being Venezuelan. Policy analysts have begun referring to what emerged as the Caracas model. It is not a treaty, it is a sequence. First, security alignment with Russia to raise military risk. Second, financial integration with China to bypass Western payment control. Third, resource concessions to pay for both. The IMF has not endorsed it, the WTO has not addressed it, but it functions. Reuters reported that officials in several sanctioned and semi-sanctioned states have studied the Venezuelan case closely, not only adversaries. Countries with long-standing alliances but rising policy friction. The lesson is not ideological, it is mechanical. Sanctions work best when there is no alternative. Alternatives now exist. This is where the emotional temperature shifts. For decades, financial power rested on centrality. The dollar system did not require force, it required participation. Venezuela's experiment suggests that exclusion can accelerate the construction of parallel systems rather than enforce compliance. The irony is structural, not political. Why this matters is straightforward. Once infrastructure exists, it does not dissolve easily. Oil contracts priced in yuan create hedging markets. Payment rails create network effects. Military systems require long-term maintenance. These are not reversible with elections or policy reviews. Analysts at the Bank for International Settlements have warned that financial fragmentation, once operationalized, tends to harden. Redundancy becomes preference. Preference becomes alignment. Venezuela has crossed that threshold. Even if sanctions were lifted tomorrow, disentangling joint oil ventures running to 2041, payment systems embedded in Chinese clearing, and security dependencies anchored in Russian hardware would take years, possibly decades. According to the Financial Times, investors already treat Venezuela as structurally non-Western in risk models. Regardless of future politics, the United States is not losing influence everywhere. It is losing exclusivity. What began as a pressure campaign ended as a prototype. A sanctioned state did not collapse. It rewired, not cleanly, not cheaply, but functionally. The final consequence is not about oil volumes or currency shares. It is about precedent. A working example now exists showing that economic isolation can be survived with sufficient external coordination. That example sits in the Caribbean, within historic United States strategic space. The balance of power did not flip overnight, it quietly rerouted. What makes this moment last is how little attention it demanded from the system around it. Trade continued, payments cleared, institutions remained open, and markets adjusted without drama. Somewhere inside that ordinary flow, authority stopped being consulted and started being bypassed. Power didn't vanish, it changed where it lived. And once decisions function without needing permission, restoring influence becomes something far harder than applying pressure. It becomes a question of relevance, remembered only if the system still depends on it. Please like and subscribe. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us grow. Thank you.